Welcome back to Through the Looking Glass podcast. My name is Lavanya. My goal is to empower listeners, even in the smallest way possible, and improve your well-being. If you find my podcast and enjoying it, please take a minute to follow and rate the show. It lets me know I'm doing a good job. Dhaval, welcome to Through the Looking Glass. How are you?
Thank
You
you.
so much for coming
I'm
on.
great. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's my pleasure. So, Val's the CEO and founder of Lotus Labs, and they have a tech product that is a wearable ring that controls objects in your house. But you are the better person to explain what your job is. Go ahead, tell the audience your job, your background, about your company, whatever you want to share.
Sure. I'm an engineer by training. Went to school at Georgia Tech for undergrad and master's. Ended up managing a division at Apple for about 8.5 years. Now currently the founder of a company called Lotus, where for people with limited mobility, we make this wearable ring that controls objects at home by pointing. But unlike Alexa, there's no apps, no rewiring, and no internet. So
Awesome.
that's our mission now.
Yeah, I love that you had the ring on to do a little show and tell. That's amazing. But let's go back to your origin story, I suppose. Tell me about maybe your days in Apple. I'm assuming that was around the time when you had the idea. How did that come about? What's the story there?
Yeah, so I think it was probably around the time I was at Apple. So this was a couple of years ago. One thing you should know about me is I was born with twisted knees. Me and my brother both, actually. And over the years, I've been on and off crutches. Now, one night a few years ago, I got into bed having left the lights on accidentally. But I was too tired to get out of bed, hop onto my crutches, hobble 10 feet, turn off the light, and vice versa. So I just slept with the lights on the entire night and woke up in the morning thinking, if an engineer like me, managing a division at Apple with expertise in wall electronics, because I've worked at Lutron and a bunch of patents, if someone like me doesn't even have smart home technology in their own home, who does? And what about all the other people like me with limited mobility? How does this impact them? And so that was the genesis of Lotus.
Yeah, I think that's such a personal story of you thinking about your own pain point, but also having the empathy to think about what about everyone else who has a similar problem that they're dealing with, and using your engineering background to come up with a solution. And I'm sure the inception of Lotus was not an overnight project. Tell me a little bit more about the journey, how you decided to exit your comfortable career in Apple and decide to, venture off on your own.
Yeah, it's a partly philosophical and partly imposter syndrome. And so the philosophical angle is, if anyone's seen Hamilton, there's a line in Hamilton which is, what is legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. And I remembered watching Hamilton, and by that point I had been at Apple for about 8 years. And I remembered thinking, 20, 30 years from now, someday, I don't know if I'll be telling my grandkids that, hey, your granddad added the 8th camera on the iPhone. Interesting, but not necessarily meaningful. And so I decided, it's time to make a change, and I kind of want to go off and do my mission. Now, of course, at around the same time, I'd had this kind of situation happen in my own home, in my own life. And so I was ruminating on this idea in the back of my mind, but I was also convinced it was the worst idea in the world. If I'm being perfectly honest, I thought it was the stupidest idea in the world, just plain and simple. And so I was originally planning on just making this little hack for myself and for nobody else. And so one of the things I did to sort of get over this imposter syndrome was I spent the first 9 months after having left my job, I spent the first 9 months just interviewing different people with disabilities, different kinds of disabilities, no disabilities, and not just them, also other people around them. So their family members and clinicians. And so after 9 months of interviews, and these were really long interviews, they were 9 hours long over 3 days. And I wouldn't even tell them the idea. I would just say, hey, I have this idea. I would love to kind of walk you through your day. And, tell me what happens. How do you get out of bed? Is that difficult? what's the pain point? How do you solve that today? So anyway, after 9 months,
Yeah.
when every single person that I interviewed said, can you please make this device already? That's when sort of this metaphorical bulb went on in my head saying, okay, well, maybe it's time.
Right, right. To get that validation from actual users and, not your best friends and family who are always going to tell you, I believe in you, I want you to do this.
Yeah,
But you kind of doubt that when it comes from someone close to you. But when there's someone has zero stake in this and they're telling you this is a great product, I think that gives you more confidence to believe
right.
in yourself. So I love the two things that you mentioned, both the philosophical aspect and the imposter syndrome aspect. I guess let's talk about one at a time. From a philosophical perspective, I think we all look for purpose in life. We want purpose in our career. Do you feel like you lacked that in your engineering career? Was that part of the motivation?
I wouldn't say that at the beginning, no. Because when I first,
Mm-hmm.
so I graduated from Georgia Tech, and then I came to Apple initially actually as an intern and then full time.
Mm-hmm.
No, I remember, this is odd. I've never shared this actually on a podcast before. I would be
Mm-hmm.
so excited to come into work
Mm-hmm.
that I would come into work at 4 a.m.
No,
Yeah, I would be there before the cleaners,
I
and
was
then I
going to
would see
mention
them.
that.
Yeah, I would see them come in around 5 a.m. or 5:30
Mm-hmm.
a.m. And so it got to a point where we knew each other by name. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, I would just, there was so much to learn. Just an incredible, because everything they teach you in school, they're kind of the bare basics, just the fundamentals
Mm-hmm.
so you understand when people are talking about something, what that means. But you don't really know if someone comes and gives you a problem saying, okay, go figure this out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You haven't really learned how to solve real world problems. You just kind of understand the basics, the physics, but you don't necessarily know how to go about A, solving the problem, and then B, implementing the solution. And so
Mm-hmm.
there was just always so much to learn. I would be looking forward to meetings. I remember back in the day, I would look at my calendar
Mm-hmm.
and wonder why I only had 2 meetings in the whole week. Of course, now it's the reverse problem. I wish for days where there are no meetings.
Yeah.
But I remember, ironically, back in the day, I would feel bad that, oh my God, today I have no meetings on my calendar. And that just sucks because I want to be in these meetings. I want to listen to people. So, no, I would say the purpose evolved, I guess is the short
Mm-hmm.
answer over time. Initially, my main goal in life was to learn. And it was amazing. Like my first year at Apple, I was learning. It was like
Mm-hmm.
drinking through a fire hose, right? It
Mm-hmm.
was this massive, like everything you touched, there was so much to learn about. And so there was never enough hours in the day to absorb everything I was trying to absorb. So it was fantastic. Over time, that if that was phase one, phase two was learning how to sort of lead. But I don't
Mm-hmm.
mean mentor anyone. I just meant leading, going from technical point A to technical point B. Like, I want to make this design
Mm-hmm.
or I want to make this product. I don't know how to do it. Figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
That was phase two. And so that was maybe the middle part of my career at Apple. At that point, once you've kind of figured that out, which is someone comes and gives you a problem and you can figure it out and you can shepherd a bunch of people, then it's mentoring. Phase three, I think, at my career at Apple was mentoring other people to do phase one and two.
Mm-hmm.
So mentoring new college grads to do phase
Right.
one and mentoring sort of more senior people to do phase two, which is how do you lead a group of people to go from point A to point B?
Right.
And so I would say kind of the trajectory evolved over the years. Initially it was learning, then it was leading, and then it was mentoring on how to lead.
Mm-hmm.
And then at some
Right.
point it started to plateau, where it started to feel like I
Yeah.
was, by the end of my 8.5 years at Apple, I had worked on every product,
Mm-hmm.
except for the desktop monitors. I had worked on the laptops, iPhone, iPad, watch,
Mm-hmm.
AirPods. And so at some point it
Yeah.
started to feel like I was starting to limit
Mm-hmm.
what I was doing and learning.
Right, right. Entrepreneurship was almost kind of like phase four for you. I don't know exactly who said it, but the gist of the phrase or metaphor is you only grow when you're uncomfortable. And I think that's
Yes.
kind of what you're implying here, right? That you grew comfortable in your career and you've kind of gotten most of what you can out of it, and it was time for you to challenge yourself and do something of your own. And there's so much merit to wanting to pursue something that is, your company, because that's having that responsibility is a lot more to take on, and I'm sure that comes with a lot of obstacles and a lot of things that you probably were not completely prepared for. And that learning process was also probably exciting for you as someone who enjoys learning, right? I asked a lot of people this, and I think everyone kind of has a different answer to this question. Do you have any suggestions or guidelines on how to choose your co-founders or partners? Any do's and don'ts in that area?
Yeah, I would. Oh, that's a really important subject, so I'm glad you're bringing it up. Yes, very, very, very important to choose your co-founder very wisely, because you will have some of the hardest, toughest, and most animated debates.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just be honest. Like in some cases, they're fights. They're actual
Yeah,
fights that you will have,
yeah.
and so
Mm-hmm.
you need to pick a person that you can fight with, and
Mm-hmm.
know that at the end of the fight, they're not going anywhere.
Right, right.
It's almost like ideally a family member. Like I actually was at a founder dinner last night. There were two
Mm-hmm.
sets of founders. One who were siblings. There were two sisters that were co-founders, and the other were a husband and a wife.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think so. In some ways, those are the types of relationships where you can fight with your sibling day in and day out for years, and at the end of the day,
Mm-hmm.
like push comes to shove, they're going to be there for you. And
Mm-hmm.
so either that, or your husband and wife, or spouses, um, yeah, some relationship like that. Now, short of that, I would say ideally not friends, but
Mm-hmm.
someone that you've worked with for a long time. That's maybe rank two, if not rank one. And the reason is it's twofold. You trust each other in your respective domains of expertise. And second, you fight and you fight well together. Like if you've worked together with anybody for a long period of time, it's almost impossible that you haven't had a disagreement at some point.
Yeah.
You've somehow gotten over that disagreement and still continue to enjoy working with each other. That's the best.
Mm-hmm. Right,
Because you've
right.
developed trust, right? You've developed trust both on your respective specialities or skill sets, but also trust that you can fight and be okay. So that
Mm-hmm.
trust is really important. Then I would say, short of that, then yes,
Mm-hmm.
long-term friends, where you've been friends for a long time. The reason I put that as rank three is
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like being friends with someone to becoming roommates with somebody.
Right.
And obviously they're related, but they're not the same. Like you can,
Yeah.
I'm sure everyone has friends that they love, but would hate to be roommates with.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like that, having a co-founder or finding a co-founder is sort of like that. It's sort of progressing a friendship to being a roommate. That brings with it a lot of other
Mm-hmm.
requirements. And so I would say, yeah, just sort of high level,
Mm-hmm.
those would be my three recommendation on
Got
do's.
it.
I think
Mm-hmm.
the don'ts would be don't do a 50-50 split. And I don't mean that in
Mm-hmm.
terms of when I say equity, I don't mean that that's a bad thing. I mean, 50-50 tends to be the easiest, least thought through way of a
Mm-hmm.
co-founder relationship. Like usually if you've done a 50-50, you haven't had the difficult conversations. It's
Mm-hmm.
usually an indicator
Yeah.
that you haven't had the difficult. Now, in some rare cases, you've had all the discussions, all the difficult conversations, and you still landed on 50-50. That's fine, but it's rare. Usually,
Mm-hmm.
after most people have those conversations, it's at least a 59-41, or sorry,
Mm-hmm.
51-49.
Yeah.
Um, or usually it's something different, saying, okay, well, I'm going to take on all these responsibilities. That means
Mm-hmm.
something different than 50%, which therefore means for you and stuff. So the idea is to have the difficult conversations upfront. And my
Mm-hmm.
second tip would be don't not put it in writing. The
Mm-hmm.
tendency
Yeah.
tends to be, well, I trust this person, maybe I've known this person for 18 years, we're just going to talk about it and that's good enough. The thing is, when you do end up having a disagreement, neither of you is going to have perfect memory. And when it's in writing, that's the source of truth. Saying, okay, we talked about this. This is what we agreed on. And so you have
Yeah.
clear delineation on what was agreed upon, even if you now need to come to a different agreement. Like your agreement made
Mm-hmm.
sense a year ago, but now things have changed and now you need a new agreement. That's fine as long as you can agree on the rules of how to disagree. And so that's why
Right.
having it written down is very, very valuable. And by the way, I'm saying all this
Mm-hmm.
because of the fact that I didn't do all of these things. I did some.
Okay, I
I
see.
did some. I
Yeah.
got some right, but
Mm-hmm.
there were some things I didn't get right. Like for instance, I wish I'd written some of
Mm-hmm.
these things down, but we
Yeah.
hadn't. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think it would have,
Right.
if not avoided the fight altogether,
Mm-hmm.
I think it would have made some of the fights shorter and quicker
Mm-hmm.
and less
Yeah.
painful.
Right, right. You're sharing your lessons so other entrepreneurs don't make the same mistakes.
Yes.
I found your like bucket one of people very interesting because I've heard the opposite from others who they would say, don't partner with family or your spouse because it's going to break up your marriage, or you're not going to be able to get along with family and you can't disagree with them. So I just thought it was like very interesting. But I think your reasoning there is also sound. So maybe it's very subjective, but
Yeah, and this is
yeah.
not to say that
Hmm.
every married couple makes good co-founders.
Hmm.
That's not what I'm
Yeah,
saying. It's
totally.
just
Yeah.
the two of you have to figure out if that works for you. So, for instance, there are a lot of my friends that are
Hmm.
married to each other, and in some cases, I actually thought they'd be fantastic co-founders. And I
Yeah.
asked them about it, and they said we've talked about it,
Hmm.
and we think we're great friends and partners and supporters of each other, and great cheerleaders, but
Hmm.
terrible co-founders together. And so we've decided not to do it.
Yeah.
My point is the reverse, which is if you're picking a
Hmm.
co-founder, make it somebody you have a deep, deep, deep relationship with, assuming they feel the
Hmm.
same and are okay with
Yeah.
that relationship and that pressure and everything that comes with it. So this is not to
Hmm.
say every marriage or every sort of married couple is good co-founders, but
Yeah.
oftentimes
Hmm.
good co-founders have deep, deep relationships. That's my point.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally. Like, for instance, me and my sister would actually make really great business partners because we have very different
Yeah.
strengths, but we know each other really well. And I think we know each other's weaknesses. So I think that's essentially what, you're getting at too. And to like add to your list, I think that one of the things you can also look for if any of the listeners are wanting to be entrepreneurs is finding people who can balance you because you're never going to
Yes.
have all the strengths. And I also really wanted to reiterate what you said about one person taking the lead, because I think everyone has a different vision. As much as you think you're going to agree 100%, you're never going to be able to agree 100%. At one point, everyone's going to have a slightly different idea of what direction to go to. And you
Yep.
just want to designate one person as the trusted individual to execute their vision. And hopefully, that person is the right person to be executing. And I think that's why you were saying, even if you're going to have like a 1% equity difference, you should rather have that, agreed upon earlier on than getting stuck because you can't agree.
Absolutely. And in fact, if for no other
Hmm.
reason, if none of these reasons kind of resonate, there's a very tactical,
Hmm.
pragmatic reason why you should do this. Why
Hmm.
50-50 more often than not, not always, but more often than not, doesn't work, or is a sign that you haven't had a designated leader. Investors hate it. If for
Right.
no other reason, you should do it
Hmm.
for, you should consider that as a factor, which is investors see that as a sign that there is no clear leader. That
Hmm.
when things come to a head, and if both co-founders disagree, there will be no way to break that gridlock. But at
Hmm.
minimum, if the equity is different, then by
Hmm.
definition of pure voting rights, one person can supersede the other, and that's that. Even if the other
Hmm.
person doesn't like it and doesn't agree with it, at least
Hmm.
that way the company can keep moving forward. And so I do think there's a lot of merit to that because you'd be surprised how much, even
Hmm.
with mostly aligning, like you
Hmm.
said, there's always that little bit of disagreement, and somebody just has
Hmm.
to make a call. And
Right.
oftentimes, and this is an important mantra that I have learned over time:
Hmm.
progress over perfection.
Hmm.
And so, even
Right.
if maybe the other
Yeah.
person was right in that 1%, making
Hmm.
progress in the grand scheme is more important than every decision being perfect.
Right. No, I love that. I think that's a great motto to have. And it definitely makes sense because at the end of the day, you want the company to grow. So my next question is sort of related to this topic. As someone who you had your strengths coming into the business as an engineer, and I'm sure you were learning a lot about business development. What's something early on in your journey that you didn't really know how to do, or you really struggled with that area? How did you overcome either learning about it or hiring someone for it, or just dealing with that challenge?
Yeah, this one I think most founders or most budding entrepreneurs will be able to relate to.
Hmm.
Fundraising. From school to college to internships, co-ops, and finally real life work, nobody gets training on fundraising. It's just not a thing. It's like
Yeah.
there's no class on it in
Hmm.
school. You can't do an internship on fundraising. Uh,
Hmm.
it's never a part of real life work. Like nobody teaches you about
Hmm.
fundraising. That's just not
Yeah.
a skill that anybody teaches you. You can't go to take a class
Right.
on it. And
Hmm.
so
Not even in MBA school. I don't
not
think we
even
have a class
yeah,
on that. No.
no, actually, I did a
Yeah.
certificate in
Hmm.
entrepreneurship in my undergrad. We took
Hmm.
everything from sales, marketing,
Hmm.
accounting, finance. There's nothing on
Hmm.
fundraising. And
Hmm.
yet, every founder will tell you that is the number one thing that's the number one part of your job is fundraising because that's nobody else's job. It's the
Hmm.
CEO's job by definition, almost by definition. The CEO can do five other things that maybe other people also do, but the one thing that nobody else can do besides the CEO is fundraising. You have to be able to do fundraising. And yet,
Hmm.
that is something that you can't learn and nobody teaches you. So, how do
Hmm.
you sort of get over it? And so, I was in the same boat, no exception.
Hmm.
And it was rough. I had sleepless nights. I would wake up with cold sweats.
Hmm.
And so, there were a few different strategies. I would say the first was for first time founders like me. I
Hmm.
think one of the things that helped the most was applying and getting into an accelerator.
Hmm.
This is not true for everybody. I certainly don't think it's necessary for second time founders.
Hmm.
Or if you've come already from a background, like maybe your family has, a background in running sort of creating new
Hmm.
entities from scratch. And so maybe just by virtue of being around your family, you've absorbed and learned those things. But it's not common for most people most of the time. So in those cases, for sort of folks like me who are skilled in something else and are moving into entrepreneurship, yeah, joining an accelerator was really helpful to me. Each person is
Hmm.
different, but I think for a lot of people, a lot of the time, an accelerator helps you learn what you don't know.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so it at least progresses you from that point to knowing what you don't know, right? Like, what is a
Yeah.
convertible note? What is a safe?
Right.
For all you know, you had never heard those words before until like
Hmm.
5 seconds ago.
Yeah.
Now you've gone from you didn't know what you didn't know, which was you didn't know this thing called a safe existed, or a convertible note existed, or a pre-money versus post-money valuation, into
Hmm.
now you know what it exists, but you don't know about it. So now you want to go learn about it.
Yeah.
And so an accelerator is great at exposing you to all those things that you need to know at some point, but you didn't even know that you didn't know. So
Right.
that's one. And then second, through sort of a series of classes, they sort of try to teach you a little bit about it. You're never going to be the
Hmm.
expert, but a little bit. So that's maybe step one. That's one piece of the puzzle. That doesn't mean that they teach you about fundraising. They tell you about the
Hmm.
mechanics of fundraising, but they don't tell
Yeah.
you how you can do it well. They don't really,
Hmm.
like that's a personal thing.
Right.
And
Right.
so I think the second piece of the puzzle was just practice,
Yeah.
constant practice over and over and over. It got to the point, and I'm not making this up, it
Hmm.
got to the point where my wife
Hmm.
knew my demo day pitch. She
Yeah.
knew my 3-minute demo day pitch word for word. She used to joke that she could
Hmm.
talk about it in her sleep, and I certainly could.
Right.
And that's
Yeah.
so. The second is just constant practice. And if
Hmm.
people don't know this as well, you should have a 3-minute, definitely
Hmm.
not more. Ideally,
Yeah.
a 2-minute or even a 1-minute version, but I think 3 minutes is the right balance.
Hmm.
You should have a 3-minute pitch that covers all the key aspects about your company by heart. Sort of, you should
Yeah.
know that word for word. And I would actually recommend writing it down. Like, write it down like a script, memorize it, and then you should be able to, at some point when you practice it enough, you should be able to start at any point in the pitch and stop at any point. So you can pull out, it doesn't have to be in order. It'll come with practice, because at some point when you've done it 50, 100, 200 times, anytime someone asks you a question, you can start at any random point in the pitch and sort of continue on from that point on. So that's puzzle piece number 2. I think puzzle piece number 3 that is underrated, but I think was hugely valuable, was talking to other founders.
Right.
And I think it was extremely helpful, not just for the tactical, well, how do you talk to investors? What do you talk about? How do you start the meeting? Do you show your slide deck up front or not? Do you email it to them? How do you set up a meeting? How do you reach out to them? How do you get a warm introduction? Leaving aside the tactical questions, I found one of the biggest help of just talking to other founders is you commiserate on how hard it is.
Right. Yeah.
And sometimes even your co-founders don't get how hard it is, because they're not pitching. They're not the one on stage or in front on these meetings where you have to just, you have to prep beforehand. You have to have all the answers to all the questions in a short soundbite way. As much as they want to be there, they don't. They just haven't experienced it. It's sort of like reading about swimming, watching somebody swim, or being in the water.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And like a co-founder is like that person who is right beside you in the pool. If you need a towel, they'll throw you a towel. They're right there. But at some point, they're not in the water with you, right? Because you're the one pitching. And so as much as they want to, they don't know. And so it helps if there's a person next to you in the pool who can commiserate on, oh my God, isn't the water extremely cold?
Right.
And they're shivering with you. And so you can just talk about that. So I would say, if nothing else, for the mental health reasons, I would strongly recommend that third piece of the puzzle, which is just find a group of founders that you can talk to, and they will be with you all throughout your journey. And so those are my 3 puzzle pieces. Accelerators, if it makes sense. Practice, other founders.
Right. No, I love that. I think that's a great 3-part tip. A little bit more about your experience as you were speaking about pitching and learning new skills, especially as a minority. How has your experience been in the world of VCs and being tech entrepreneur?
Very good question. It's mixed. I'm not going to say it's easy.
Yeah.
It's hopeful and inspiring in some ways, and there are other times it's hard. So what do I mean by that?
Tell me more. Yes.
I'm big on quotes, so I tend to use this in my thinking a lot. There was a phrase I came across often, which was, you can't be what you can't see. And when it comes to minority founders, unless you see someone as, you're used to seeing a female CEO, or you're used to seeing a person of color as CEO, or you're used to seeing them in a leadership role, or as a VC, right? Even seeing kind of a woman VC or a person of color that's a VC, and constantly being able to see a lot of them, it's definitely intimidating, right? At minimum, because sometimes they don't necessarily understand some things that are well known in your culture or the way or your upbringing, because it's not a given. You have to kind of educate them on these unwritten rules around the way certain things are. Like, for instance, in the Indian culture, I remember when I first told my parents that I was leaving Apple, and I'm not making this up, my mom's exact first words, this was in Hindi, so I'll translate it in English.
Yeah.
Her exact first words were, "Who is going to marry you now?" Those were her exact...
I had a feeling it was going to be something like that.
Yeah, those were her literal exact first words. Who is going to marry you now? And, so it's really, like, entrepreneurship is not really looked up as this positive thing. It's, it's more than this negative. Like, why are you giving up a stable, good job at a big, well-known company like Apple, where on top of all that, you are growing, right? Like, I was rising through the ranks. Why would you give all that stability and growth up for this thing that we don't even fully understand? It's not clear how it would be successful, and it's hard. It's really hard. And you're
Mm-hmm.
going to put all your, finances at risk, and not to mention you're going to spend all this money trying to make that happen, right? It's a double whammy. You're not earning money, you have no salary,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to
Mm-hmm.
spend to make this dream a reality. Like, this makes no
Yeah.
sense. Why would you ever do this?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so, if you're talking to a VC, or you're talking to other founders, or you're surrounded by like-minded founders who come from that cohort or that community,
Mm-hmm.
they kind of understand and can help you get over those unwritten rules, the stuff that nobody
Yeah.
talks about.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in that sense, it was initially hard.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, for those of you listening, I'm a first generation immigrant
Mm-hmm.
to the US. I did not grow up here. I actually was born in India, raised in Dubai.
Mm-hmm.
I had a massive culture shock when I came to the US for lots of reasons, but I basically came here for my undergrad. So I came here when I was 18.
Mm-hmm.
I not only know anybody here, like in
Yeah.
general, my network is limited, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know people that I met through school and internships and through work. It's not like my family is here, or they
Yeah.
know lots of people who are VCs, or they know lots of people who have have gone down the entrepreneurship route in the US and have done things. Like, I had nobody to reach out to at the
Mm-hmm.
very start.
Yeah.
I have a brother. He's a consultant at Deloitte. There was nobody I could talk to. And on top of all that, because I'm an immigrant, I'm on H-1B visa,
Mm-hmm.
which disallows you. You can't even be an entrepreneur if you're on that visa. So my first step was to figure out,
Mm-hmm.
well, how do I even
Yeah.
incorporate a company if I'm on a visa?
Right.
So I
Yeah.
had to get over that hurdle somehow. Long story short, I
Mm-hmm.
ended up
Mm-hmm.
applying under a very different category, something called EB1, employment-based
Mm-hmm.
category 1,
Okay.
specifically the A subcategory, which is reserved for actors and athletes. In fact, the very
I
first thing
see.
that it says on the USCIS
Mm-hmm.
website, the government website, is if
Mm-hmm.
you have won a Nobel Prize or an Oscar, you
Yeah.
may apply under this category. So, for instance, John Oliver actually got his
Mm-hmm.
green card under that
Mm-hmm.
category. So it's meant for
I
sort of
see.
arts, performing arts, and athletes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm an engineer, it doesn't fit. In
Yeah.
fact, my
Mm-hmm.
attorney refused to file my petition for 3
Mm-hmm.
months. And I had to convince him, saying, okay, I'm reinterpreting all these requirements, and I think I can meet them because I have all these patents. By the time I'd left Apple, I
Mm-hmm.
had 37 patents. So I was able to sort
Mm-hmm.
of rejigger all the requirements and reinterpret. And the government didn't agree the first time. It took me 18 months to convince them, after
Mm-hmm.
2 rounds of applications,
Yeah.
to finally get my green card to be able to start the company. That was just step one.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so that, stuff like that is hard because I had nobody, I couldn't call anybody up saying, how did you do it?
Yeah. It
There was
must have been
nobody.
so isolating to not have had your support system, and even your family must have been there either back in Dubai or India. So you didn't really have anyone to kind of help you through it.
Right.
I want to know more about that experience of having gone through that and kind of figured things out for yourself, which I'm sure is character building in the process.
Yeah.
But what's your, looking back now, do you have any takeaways on how you would maybe guide others who might be in that position?
I mean, yeah, tactically, if you're a first generation
Hmm.
immigrant and you are
Yeah.
trying to sort of start your own venture, definitely reach out. Happy to kind of walk you through the mechanics, both legal and immigration. I would say, more importantly, philosophically,
Yeah.
in a way, I think it was good. It was good and bad. It was good in the sense it really forced me to double down on, do I really want to do this?
Hmm.
And I
Right.
say that because too often the perception that gets portrayed, I think this is gradually over time being reduced, but
Hmm.
too often the perception that's portrayed is, I would love to do entrepreneurship because you are your own
Hmm.
boss, or
Yeah.
start your own venture because you get to set the hours you work. And
Hmm.
those are all true, but to a very limited degree. And for those of you thinking that
Hmm.
you are your own boss, I
Yeah.
guess in an org sense that is partially true, but in
Hmm.
a realistic sense, you're not your own boss. You tend to have a board of directors. Your investors are your boss. Your customers are your boss. Like, there's all these people who, in fact, in the way I would describe it is, instead of having one boss, you have like 10 or 20
Mm-hmm.
or 30 bosses.
Mm-hmm.
In many ways,
Yeah.
it's harder because you don't have this one person you're trying to convince. You have to convince all these people. So, you know, there's all these fictitious perceptions that have been built around entrepreneurship and oftentimes are all the wrong reasons to become a founder. And so, in a way, I think it's good that it's like a rite of passage. It's good that there are all these, it's not the easiest thing to become a founder because it filters out all the people doing it all for the wrong reasons. And it's a good thing because you actually don't want to be 2 years into your journey only to realize that, oh my God, this is not for me. Or this is not really, like, I love entrepreneurship, but I hate this mission. Like, why am I doing this? I made another app and I hate apps, but I just did it because I thought it would make me quick money, or I could be my own boss, or I could set my own hours, or I don't have to report to anybody. Like, those are all the wrong reasons to do it. And so I think that was the good side of things. Of course, I would have loved to have been able to start my startup sooner, but I got delayed by about 18 months for that reason. But like you said, it's character building. I think you realize that this is early learnings for what needs to become a muscle that you will use throughout the life of the startup, because you're constantly going to be problem solving and you're constantly having to put together a playbook because there is no playbook for the problem you're trying to solve. And so building that muscle memory, the earlier, the better.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely true. And I think what you said resonates with me, and I'm sure a lot of listeners will resonate with what you're sharing here too. Two things I want to kind of talk about a little bit more. One, just the perception of being an entrepreneur in the South Asian community. And I think you were so spot on with your example of the lack of understanding that you might have from family members because it's this unknown, chartered path. Typically, like, I mean, as you know, you want your parents are gonna, if you have Indian parents or maybe even most Asian parents, they're gonna tell you to be doctor, lawyer, engineer, right? Like those are the trusted paths.
100%.
Yeah. And I like when you're going off of that path and you're doing your own thing, there's that fear of insecurity, and there's fear of not being financially independent, and there's all these things that is really very fear mindset oriented, right? But to be a founder, you by definition are someone who's trying to be creative, trying to do things different from others. And that's how, interesting new and innovative products get created when you're thinking outside of the box. And I'm sure that comes with a lot of struggle with, one having to balance maybe different opinions that you don't necessarily agree with. And two, maybe yourself as well, because there's a lot of having to process these things and maybe managing your own mindset. So I want to talk more about that, and we can kind of tie it back into the topic of imposter syndrome as well. But I'll let you kind of share what your thoughts are so far from, these topics. If you want to add more to those experiences that you've had.
I mean, the one example that comes to mind, I like using examples. My parents went from being able to say, what does your son do in the US? So they live in Dubai, and my extended family is in India. So if someone came up to them and said, hey, what does your son do in the US? They could say he works for Apple. They didn't really, they didn't know the specifics. Well, he's in electrical engineering, manages this division. The specifics are irrelevant. He works for Apple.
Yeah.
What can they say when you've quit that job and you just started something new? It's not even clearly defined, right? Because you're probably working on it. In my case, it was hardware. It was not built yet. There's nothing to show. What do they say when they meet the same friends saying, okay, what does your son do now? How do they answer that question, right? Especially, this is true for the South Asian community, especially because it's a very communal living culture. And it's not just your parents. What do you, I want to share this partially. It was hard on me.
Yes.
Because when I would, at some point you meet your friends, you go out for dinner or lunch, or you catch up for a movie. And the first question is, so how are things?
Yeah.
What do you do these days?
Right. Yeah.
And at the earliest stages, and I mean the first week or the first month, you don't have anything to show for your quote startup.
Yeah.
if you're lucky, you have a name. If you're
Mm-hmm.
lucky, you've incorporated by that point. So, you can say, okay, we're officially incorporated.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next time you meet them for dinner, what do you say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? Because there's a non-negligible portion of time where you're working, but
Mm-hmm.
there are no visible outcomes. You're just working
Right.
on it's like if I give you the analogy of a building, there's a period of time where you don't see the building
Mm-hmm.
being built. You just see this massive hole in the
Right.
ground,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? For you're
Mm-hmm.
going to do the foundation and the rebar and all this stuff. Sorry, my dad is an architect, so I kind of nerd out about some of those things.
Right.
Um, but there's this period of time, and so it's hard on founders too. And so
Mm-hmm.
I guess my food for thought for anyone thinking of going down the entrepreneurship track, it's wonderful. You will learn the most that you have ever learned in your life. It's a beautiful journey. It's a great introspection of self.
Mm-hmm.
The test, I think, in my mind would be, what would you be willing to do if you
Mm-hmm.
knew you couldn't get a salary or you couldn't talk about it for 5 years?
Mm-hmm. Right.
What is
Yeah.
that thing that you were so passionate about that even if you couldn't point to something and say, this is what I'm doing, because there's
Mm-hmm.
nothing to show,
Yeah.
and or you were getting no money doing it. And this is
Mm-hmm.
very real, by the way. I'm still not drawing a paycheck,
Yeah.
and I'm 3 years into this.
Mm-hmm.
My team now, thankfully, is drawing a paycheck, but I'm still not drawing a paycheck. So not just that, it's a double negative, right? Because the first year and a half of the company, I spent my savings
Mm-hmm.
to make
Right.
progress. So I'm not earning a salary and I'm
Right.
reducing my savings.
Mm-hmm.
What is that thing that you're so passionate about that even if you couldn't point to something and you couldn't earn any money doing it, what would you do? And that's how high the bar should be
Yeah.
before you choose to kind of come down this track. Because I'm not going to lie, it's very hard. There are some days
Yeah.
that I just don't want to get out of bed, and it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
sometimes it's just in your mind, like you were just mentioning. Sometimes it's so difficult that in your mind,
Mm-hmm.
your imposter syndrome starts to come up, saying, "Can you do this? Why are people taking me seriously?"
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. And listening to you, I have so much empathy for what you might have been like feeling in that situation, right? Tell me more about how you think putting ourselves in that position, what is your advice in general to maybe counteract these either mindset oriented or if it's, even actionable things that you can do to maybe deal with being in that situation, assuming, like you said, you already are someone who's meeting all those prerequisites that we already talked about to even have the mindset and the passion really to be a founder, right?
Yeah, I would
Mm-hmm.
say for this, maybe this is not. I don't want to give advice, but I would say what worked for
Mm-hmm.
me.
Yeah.
So in my head, I'm almost too analytical. Like it's hard. It's
Mm-hmm.
hard for me for imposter syndrome reasons, and
Mm-hmm.
otherwise, it's hard for me to accept a compliment. I assume
Mm-hmm.
people are just being polite.
Yeah. Right. Right.
So for me, so even when people came and told me, "Oh my God, you're doing so well. I see
Mm-hmm.
all these things on social media,"
Mm-hmm.
that was hard for me to accept. So again, that made it harder for
Mm-hmm.
me. So the only thing that worked for me was one was raw data.
Mm-hmm.
And the clearest evidence for me was looking back
Mm-hmm.
X number of years in the past. And it can be anything. So if this is week one of you starting a startup,
Mm-hmm.
look back onto maybe your work life and
Mm-hmm.
how far you've come along.
Mm-hmm.
Or look back onto your college years and how far you've come along. And the
Mm-hmm.
easiest example of this
Yeah.
is to look back and find an old email or an
Mm-hmm.
old book report or an old PowerPoint that you created
Mm-hmm.
versus
Yeah.
one you are creating now. And I
Mm-hmm.
promise you're going to cringe, right? If you look for, if
Yeah.
you find an old email,
Yeah.
if you find an old report, a written report, or you
Totally.
filed an old PowerPoint, you're going to
Mm-hmm.
cringe. You're like, oh my God, I can't believe I used to write emails like that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's amazing
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
because that means you have grown in the
Yes.
interim,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if you're cringing, you know that, oh my God, those were all the things I was doing wrong. You're obviously not
Mm-hmm.
doing that anymore. That's clearly data showing you have progressed.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, looking back and seeing how far I have come, not necessarily even in the startup, just in general. So
Mm-hmm.
looking back at my day one at Apple and year 8 at Apple, or looking at my first day at Georgia Tech and my last day at Georgia Tech, or
Yeah.
now looking back at the first day of Lotus, where I was in this room and it was an empty space and I was just blank sheet of paper, to where we are today.
Yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't feel like that because it's slow and, you know, things add up slowly over time. And so I feel like that looking back at that data was a very pragmatic way of saying, okay, you know, maybe you're not getting everything right, but you're certainly getting some things really right, and you're certainly not getting everything wrong. And for me, that really helped counteract the, you know, this sense of, well, I don't know. One thing would be leaning on your community as much as possible. And I say this because sometimes things are just hard and there's no data to go off of.
Yeah.
There's this thing with imposter syndrome, which is sometimes other people believe in you more than you believe in yourself. And there are days you actually need that. You need to rub off other people's belief in you than your belief in yourself. Because maybe you had a rough day and you had 5 meetings and none of them went according, you know, to plan, or none of them went the way you wanted. Your community or your village has seen what you have pulled off over the years. And they don't know the specifics of how your day went, right? They don't know what happened in the meeting. They don't know what all the little things that are going wrong.
Right.
They just know how you have dealt with hardships in the past and stuff that you've pulled off. And so they have this belief, this unshaken belief that, oh my God, I know you and I know how you're going to figure something out. I don't even know how you're going to do it. I just know you will, because this is not the first time this has happened. This is not the first time in your life I've seen you deal with something tough. I've seen you do it like 15 times before.
Yeah.
So I know you can do it. And sometimes you need to hear that from somebody else. And so I would say those are my two. Look back at your own history and sometimes just lean on your community and believe in their belief in your potential.
No, totally. And I completely resonate with that. You know, being a female engineer and my own experiences with that, what you said, I think applies to more than, you know, entrepreneurs, right? I think anyone who's a minority who is in corporate America is likely experiencing these feelings and finding ways to counteract them. So to kind of wrap up our conversation today, what is your kind of final, I know you shared lots of great advice and lots of lessons today with me, and I really appreciate that. But if there's one last final lesson that you want to share to aspiring entrepreneurs, what would it be?
Oof, no pressure.
I know it's hard to pick one.
I would say if there's one thing, and if it was only one thing, your only job as CEO or your only job as founder is to make the company survive. That's it. Yeah. That's your job. It's to have the company survive for as long as possible. And the longer it survives, the more good things the more it has opportunity for good things to happen. So my advice follows from that. Given that that's your responsibility, my advice is to pick a mission where you can just stay persistent. Fall after fall after fall, just because you care so deeply about it or you believe in it so firmly that it doesn't matter how many times you fall off the horse, you can just get right back on. And I'm not saying that's easy. You know, every time you fall off the horse, it'll hurt, and that's okay. But just not getting back on the horse is just not an option. And the best way to think about this is babies. Right? Babies fall when they're trying to walk initially all the freaking time. I don't think if you asked or if you got into the mind of a baby, I don't think not trying to get up is even an option. Right. Yeah. Like, I don't think it even crosses their mind that, okay, well, oh my God, I fell down 15 times today and my butt hurts. Yeah. But tomorrow I'm just going to give up on standing. Like I'm not just not going to do that anymore. And so my advice, given that the job is all about surviving and making the company survive, pick a mission that you care so deeply about that you're just going to keep persisting no matter what. And And I think that
Yeah.
to me is probably the most important advice I could probably give to
Hmm.
anybody considering starting on this journey.
Right. Yeah, no, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you so much again for coming on my podcast. We really appreciate you. I am going to leave your information and your company's website in the description if anyone wants to learn more about Lotus or reach out to you directly if they want to connect. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure being here, and I hope